Hello and good evening, and a very warm welcome to Elena Ferrante fans everywhere. My name is Joan Concannon, and I'm the director of the York Festival of Ideas, a free festival dedicated to educating, entertaining, and inspiring diverse audiences. So before we get started, a few technical notes. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A function button on your screen. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have technical issues, such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again on our York Ideas YouTube channel, and please do tell all of your friends. Subtitles are available at this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your screen. We are delighted to host this evening's event. Elena Ferrante has excited a worldwide passionate following, and we're delighted to be joined by three incredible speakers. Merve Emre is Associate Professor of English at the University of Oxford. She is the author of Paraliterary, The Making of Bad Readers in Post-War America, the Ferrante Letters, and the Personality Brokers, which she actually spoke about a couple of years ago in physical form at the York Festival of Ideas, and more importantly, was selected as one of the best books of 2018 by the New York Times, The Economist, NPR, CBC, and The Spectator. She's the editor of Once and Future Feminist and a centennial edition of Mrs. Dalloway, forthcoming from Liveright. In 2019, she was awarded a Philip Leverhulme Prize, and her work has been supported by the Whiting Foundation, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Leverhulme Trust, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin, where she is currently a fellow. She's also currently finishing a book called Post-Discipline, Literature, Professionalism, and the Crisis of the Humanities, I think something many of us can feel, and starting a book called Woman, The History of an Idea. Merve is also a regular contributor to The New Yorker, and if you haven't read her pieces on The New Yorker, I strongly urge you to do so, and the New York Review of Books, and I don't actually know when she finds time to sleep. We're also delighted to have Ann Goldstein here. Ann is a former editor at The New Yorker. She's translated works by, among others, Elena Ferrante, Pier Paolo Pasolini, and Alessandro Barrico, and is the editor of the complete works of Primo Levi in English. She has been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and awards from the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And finally, one of my very favorite journalists, Isabel Berwick, who is the Financial Times Work and Careers Editor. She oversees its coverage of leadership, management, office life, and the present and post-pandemic future of work, something we're all incredibly interested in. In addition, she is a regular fiction reviewer for the FT book pages. Isabel joined the FT in 1999 from The Independent on Sunday, where she was the business editor. This event actually came about somewhat ironically on a lazy Sunday morning, wandering around Twitter as I do, and I came across a truly wonderful essay about Elena Ferrante, written by Merve, which when I commented on the beauty of Merve's writing, which I often do, it elicited an enthusiastic response from Isabel, who it turned out is also a passionate Ferrante fan. And it was the work of moments to matchmake these two amazing women on Twitter and suggest an event. And then Merve suggested that we join forces and have the wonderful Anne join us as well. And so here we are tonight, and I'm going to hand over to the fabulous Merve Emre, and please enjoy the event and do post questions as we go along in the Q&A. Thank you, and over to you, Merve.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Joan, for that wonderful introduction. I'm very excited to be here with Anne and with Isabel. So there are many different frameworks that I could give you to read Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels, which, as I'm sure most of the people joining us today know, tell the story of a prickly friendship between two girls, Lila and Lenu, growing up in post-war Italy. And I will try to speak about the novels in such a way that I don't give any, that I don't reveal any spoilers for those who haven't made their way through all four of them. The first way that one could read the Neapolitan novels is as an extended Kunstleroman. What is a Kunstleroman? It is an artist's novel. It is a novel that tells the story of how an artist came to be the successful and world-renowned painter or novelist or poet that they are. And of course, one of the most famous Kunstlerromans we can think of is the portrait of an artist as a young man. And one of the things that we see in the Neapolitan novels is the story of Lenu's rise to become a successful novelist. And the way that from her beginnings in childhood poverty, in violence, in the neighborhoods of Naples, she makes her way through a highly regimented school system. She becomes a very, very good student, and she learns how to speak a particular idiom, the idiom of the middle-class bourgeois writer. And at the same time that she does this, her friend Lila, her brilliant friend Lila, remains behind, and Lila's life provides Lenu with a great deal of the material that she uses or that she assimilates into the novels and the nonfiction that she writes. So there's one frame that we could use for thinking about the Neapolitan novels as a whole, an extended Kunstlerroman. The second frame we could use for thinking about them is as a historical fiction, a social realist novel that tells the story of what happens in Italy after the fascists fall from power, with the rise of the Christian Democrats and the Communist Party struggling against them. And we could think of these two characters as being enmeshed in a much larger web of social and political relations that extends out from them through the neighborhood, through Naples, through Italy, and finally to the world at large. And for those of you who have read the fourth novel, The Story of the Lost Child, you will know that that kind of imagination of the world expanding around her is precisely what Lenu engages in toward the very, very end of the quartet. So we could think about these novels as using the relationship between these two girls and their place in the world to refract a whole set of social and political problems or conditions that were present in post-war Italy. The third way we could think about the Neapolitan novels is as an epic, a myth, because these novels do have those extraordinary magical elements to them. And those of you who have read the first novel, My Brilliant Friend, will of course remember the moment when the copper pot explodes. And it seems to be a kind of terrible omen of what is to come in Lila's marriage to Stefano. You will also remember the extraordinary descriptions that Lenu gives us in her capacity as a narrator of the neighborhood, the monstrous Don Achille, the anger that infects the women of the neighborhood as if they were infected with tiny emotional vermin. And the classic story of epic, or the classic trajectory of epic, is the hero who departs home, undertakes a journey, and then returns. And this is one of the other things that we see in the kind of arc of the Neapolitan novels, is Lenu leaving the neighborhood, going off into the world, gathering a set of skills, having a set of experiences, and then coming back to the neighborhood, coming back home, making her return journey. And then the fourth frame I want to give you for thinking about the novels is as a melodrama of women's friendship. Because for me, the Neapolitan novels take the cruelty and the compassion, the care and the responsibility, the entrustment that orbits these women's friendships, and they ratchet all of those things up to an unbelievably high pitch. And I'm sure I'm not the only one here who has read those novels, as I was telling Isabel earlier, in a state of utter anxiety and utter desire, completely hungry to know what happens next. And the way that their plots pull you along at the same time that they're doing all of this complicated historical and theoretical and conceptual work is, to me, one of the things that makes them completely extraordinary. So I read the Neapolitan novels for the first time when I was probably a little bit older than Lila and Lenu are in the second book. And now I think I am more or less where they are in the third book. And I read them before I had my own children. I think I read them before I was married. And I think a lot about what it is that keeps me coming back to these novels. Because as I think we'll speak about today, people tend to attribute to Ferrante's novels, they tend to claim that the novels are new or are doing new things in how they represent women, how they represent feminism that are not in fact all that new. But what is it about the way that Ferrante reinscribes a certain set of familiar problems that makes her writing so utterly compelling? And when I was trying to think about an answer to this question, and I try to figure out an answer to this question fairly regularly, usually every time I reread or teach the novels, this time I landed on something that I would like to offer to you, and we can test this idea out in our conversation. I'm fascinated by Lenu as a first-person narrator. There have been many, many unreliable narrators in the history of the novel, and we are, of course, used to narrators who don't always tell the truth or who try to manipulate us in order to compel us as the reader to follow them to places we may not want to go. Think, for instance, of Humbert Humbert in Lolita. Or they may try to manipulate us in order to compel us to make a certain set of ethical or moral judgments or political judgments that we might not otherwise make. But one of the things that is utterly fascinating to me about Elena Ferrante's first-person narrator is that it is a narrator who is, of course, unreliable, but a narrator who does not seem to be fully in control of her narration. So what do I mean by that? I mean that across all four novels, we watch the narrator tell stories in ways that set her up in the best possible light. We watch her deflect, we watch her deny, we watch her conceal, and then suddenly reveal things that seem to come as a genuine surprise even to her. And I think that there are all of these moments in the Neapolitan novels where it doesn't feel like one of the novels knows what the other was doing. Where revelations about the narrator's motivations or her intentions come as a genuine surprise to her. And Lenu has these moments of self-discovery that happen to her not as a character, but as the person telling a story in hindsight. I think that is an extraordinarily hard thing to pull off, to create that trick of narrative self-discovery. But it's also, to my mind, one of the most real or one of the most true things that the novel gets at. That as we progress through our lives, we often don't know what our own actions or motivations meant. We don't often understand the lies that we tell ourselves and others until we've had a really significant amount of distance from them. And to create that process of self-deception and then self-recovery or self-revelation, and to do it so that that becomes part of the drama of the novel is, at least in this last rereading for me, what makes Elena Ferrante's novels so extraordinary, and what also sets up a really wonderful continuity, I think, between the Neapolitan Quartet and the most recent of her novels, The Lying Life of Adults, which I highly recommend that you all read, because I think its theory of how we lie and why we lie and what the relationship is between lying and fiction is a kind of key to unlock Ferrante's project more generally. So I will stop there and pass it off to Ann Goldstein, who as the translator of Elena Ferrante's novels actually, I think, embodies what I was talking about, that the translator takes control of the narrative to a certain degree. And so I'm excited to hear what she has to say about that kind of collaboration, or just anything else that she's going to talk about.
Thank you, Merve, and thank you, Joan, and thank you, Isabel. I'm actually going to speak in a very different way about Elena Ferrante. I thought I would just give the history of all her novels, just as in a kind of straightforward way, I think. So in 1992, the pseudonymous Elena Ferrante, and I imagine we might talk about that a little bit too, published her first novel, L'amore molesto, or Troubling Love. And 10 years later, she published her second novel, The Days of Abandonment, which was the first to be published in English in 2005, and the first book to be published by Europa Editions, an American spin-off of the Italian publisher Edizione AO. In 2006, excuse all these dates, she published La Figlia Oscura, The Lost Daughter. All three novels are short, around 200 pages, compact, intensely focused explorations of a brief period in a woman's life. Each has a middle-aged woman narrator who grew up in Naples but has left the city and in a sense, her background and her past. In Troubling Love, the narrator, who lives in Rome, returns to Naples to investigate the mysterious death of her mother, and in the process, the secrets and lies of her own childhood. The Days of Abandonment, which takes place in Turin, is about the descent into near madness of a woman with 2 children whose husband leaves her for a younger woman. Here, Naples recurs in the form of an abandoned woman of the narrator's childhood who could not endure her abandonment and killed herself. The Lost Daughter is about a woman on vacation who steals a doll on the beach and her entanglement with the Neapolitan family of the child the doll belongs to. In 2011, My Brilliant Friend, or L'Amica Geniale, was published in Italy, and a year later in the US and England. When I began reading it, I felt that in some ways I had entered a familiar, recognizable world, the Turin of the Days of Abandonment, the Naples of Troubling Love, the middle-aged woman narrator, the strong, almost physical language of emotion and description. But I was also reading something completely different. For one thing, the book was more than twice as long as the previous books, and it was only the first book of what at the time was projected to be a trilogy, and ended up, as of course, as a tetralogy. It began with a framing device. A woman of 66 is seeking to investigate, not literally, as the narrator of Troubling Love investigates the death of her mother, but psychologically, the disappearance of her closest and oldest friend. To do so, she goes back to their childhood with the intention of writing down everything she remembers about their lives in order to recapture and perhaps comprehend them. In the course of something like 1,800 pages, Ferrante narrates in sometimes excruciating psychological detail the story of Elena, the narrator, and of Lila, her friend, born into poverty in a crumbling, violent neighborhood on the outskirts of Naples. As the translator, I lived with the characters in my head quite vividly and over a long period of time. I seemed to inhabit a world with them, getting to know intimately their families, their friends, their struggles, experiencing what happens to them, marriages, births, deaths, loves, hatreds, over some 6 decades, and reacting to them the way I might to real people. I would get angry, annoyed, be sympathetic or not. I hoped and feared for them as I saw them grow up and change and age, and in some cases die, as we do with people in our own life. I think that's one of the reasons these books are so compelling. It's not so much that as readers we identify with the details of these lives, since most of us did not grow up amid violence and poverty in an outlying neighborhood of Naples, but we do identify with and recognize the people themselves and their relationships with each other and with life, and perhaps with their desire to find order or sense in their lives. I felt bereft when I came to the end, as if something were missing from my life. The Lying Life of Adults, La vita bugiarda degli adulti, which was published last fall, also has a first-person narrator, but here we're in the first person of a teenager, that is 12-year-old Giovanna. Many of the themes from the earlier books recur: women and their bodies, sex and virginity, female friendships, girls or women and their mothers, and even more here, girls and their fathers. The city of Naples and its manifestations of class. The symbolism can be literal, actually. Class itself and the dialect-Italian relationship. When I started working on The Lying Life, it seemed to me much like the earlier novels. It had a similar quality of a single point of view, a single person, a confined period of time. But in other ways, it's not like the earlier novels. It has a broader range of characters and it's not so contained. But like all Ferrante's novels, and even though Giovanna is in a way quite unsympathetic, it pulls you in. The intense focus of the narrator on her own psychology and what is happening to her is gripping. And as in all these novels, Ferrante's ability to analyze and dramatize motives, emotions, relations, to excavate them, to use a term she uses herself, is tremendous and moving. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was wonderful. I've written down so many things from that. As a reader rather than an expert in Ferrante, I wanted to pick up something Merve said to perhaps chat about first, about the lying and the truth, or the lies we tell each other, and how that relates to the fiction, because I know Ferrante's, I've in the book Fantumalia, which I believe you also translated, Anne, which is a sort of collection of all the interviews she's done and various other sort of bits of ephemera. Yeah. She repeatedly says that fiction is better than autobiography in terms of getting, or excavating, we might say, to the truth. How is it about, what is it about the relationship to truth that is so different and compelling. I just can't put my finger on it. Merve, what did you want to say more about the relationship with lying? Because it's in all her novels. All of these people are deluded, self-deluded, or, you know, or perhaps just not aware of their own motives.
Well, I think I would start with just pointing out that there is an intimate relationship between fiction and lying. And prior to the invention of fiction as a category, stories were considered lies. Before we had a category called fiction that we used to name these made-up stories, we thought of them as being untruthful. And so to me, there is a really interesting way that the idea of fiction is, on the one hand, an elaborate sort of lie. The people that one writes about never really existed. They didn't do the things that you claim they did as the novelist. And on the other hand, and Ferrante says this too, fiction is more elevated than the ordinary lies, she calls them, that people tell. And the ordinary lies are the lies that people tell in their lives because they are cowardly, because they are self-deceiving, because they don't want to take too close a look at who they are or who they have become or what they have made of their lives. And I think we all have these moments, right, where you seem to live your life as if it's a series of choices that you've made, and one day you wake up and you look around at it and you say, how did I get here? I don't recognize this. And I think the beauty of the lies that fiction tells is that you can tell truths like that you are too afraid to tell yourself in the context of your real life. And so you can speak truthfully through the veil of fiction's lies, its imagination, what it makes up, in a way that I think many people don't feel authorized to do in a non-fictional space or a non-fictional setting.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that Ferrante, I mean, she seems to go to someplace, exactly as you said, to someplace that isn't, that you wouldn't go yourself. She goes past the place where you might go yourself. And that you can, and so you can accept it when it comes from her, or when it's in the fictional character. It's something that you might not accept in yourself.
I mean, this is what is, to me, really wonderful about the life of adults, at least, is that, I mean, one of the things you realize reading it is that adults are, it is rarer to find an adult who is honest than not. And that part of what growing up is learning to tell, in that novel at least, part of what growing up means is learning to tell compelling lies, and learning to tell lies that don't reek of the excesses of bad fiction, lies that aren't overly fantastical, lies that one could never believe in because they rely on something supernatural happening.
Yeah.
And that being a grown-up is about becoming a skillful liar.
Wow. And that, I suppose, this idea of fiction, layers of fiction, takes us perhaps inevitably onto the identity of the author, which she believes is not important, that the work speaks for itself, and within the work we find the truth of her. I don't know, how do you both feel about this sort of incessant chase for her identity? Once I'd read the whole of Fantomalia, I was thoroughly sick of it, because every single journalist went on and on and on. And I thought, actually, it really does, you know, if you're a fan of the books, it really ceases to be important. What's your relationship with her anonymity, Merve? And I'd be interested to hear from you too, Anne.
Anne, why don't you start? Because you have more
direct with her anonymity. Well, actually, in Fantomalia, one of my favorite answers to that question is, she says, it's the end. Who is Elena Ferrante? 13 letters. But I've never been bothered by her anonymity. And she started out right from the beginning saying, I am going to be anonymous. I'm not going to do anything for my books. I'm not going to promote them. I'm not going to be present. She has this other great line where she says, I wrote the books, isn't that enough? I don't mind it. I mean, I think that she should be left alone. to be anonymous if she wants to be. I've heard other writers say they wish they could do that. So, you know, I think it's a fair position to take, and nobody should bother her about it.
I thought this was going to be the evening where Anne finally admits that she is Elena Ferrante.
Yeah, well, I don't know who she is, by the way.
I also do not care at all who she is. But I do think that the anonymity is used to great and tantalizing effect. For instance, naming the character in your novel, naming the narrator after your pseudonym is obviously a kind of invitation. And I think it's playful. And I think it's asking us to do what we almost always do, even when as critics, we've had it sort of beaten out of us, which is to misidentify the author with the narrator. And to think that what we're getting is some kind of unmediated life story. And I think we are fascinated by other people's unmediated life stories. I think there's something really thrilling to us about the fact that a total stranger might be confiding really deep and dark and painful things in us. So I do think that, you know, while I agree that it doesn't matter, and I do think she should be left alone, there is a certain charge that the novels gain from the way that the anonymity is used, and from the fact that these novels narrate, at least in part, a woman who is a talented writer, who is anonymous, or who is anonymous, right? And that's Lila, in the Lila-Lenu pairing, right? The great genius, the brilliant friend, the one who writes The Blue Fairy, the one who edits Lenu's writing secretly behind the scenes, and Nino's writing, the person who's capable of taking material and shaping it into the most compelling form. And I think the anonymity of that character is also another place where her anonymity as an author is being really seductively refracted in the novels.
There's a really interesting question here, actually, and viewers, please do send your questions in. For you, Anne, does Ferrante's anonymity change Anne's approach to translation? Is it a freedom or a hindrance, for example?
Well, it's kind of neither. I mean, I've, so to speak, worked with a lot of dead authors, so it's kind of like having a dead author. I mean, in that sense. But I mean, yes, of course, since she isn't a dead author, I can think that she's looking at what I'm doing. But I don't really have a relationship with her, so I can't. I mean, I don't have an actual relationship with her. On the other hand, I have a relationship with her because I spend so much time in her eye, whatever that eye is that she's narrating in. I become that eye for the length of the time that I'm working on the book. And it's funny because people started talking about her as an unreliable narrator. And I never could understand that because seemed to think that I was so much that eye. I couldn't think that it was unreliable. I mean, I couldn't see past it in a sense. So that's, you know, it's kind of an odd relationship that I think that if the writer was actually present, I think it would be a little bit different in a way.
So it's a kind of, it's a sort of, yes, it's a different relationship. And we touched a little bit on the role of dialect earlier, and I'm really interested in how you get that over in English, because it's not something that we have any equivalent of. Is it in the Italian, is it very obvious where they're speaking in dialect? How does it work?
No, because she doesn't write in dialect. She basically doesn't write. And she says, she writes in Italian, he said in dialect, and then she goes on in Italian. So you're not missing anything. I mean, yes, there's some difference because usually it's conversation, so it's a little more colloquial, let's say, the Italian, but it's not, she doesn't use, I mean, in a way, this is kind of what Merve was talking about, I mean, it's about lies and about using anonymity. I mean, she doesn't use dialect literally, but she uses it all the time as a metaphor and as a way of indicating certain things, you know, certain differences, the differences in the way people speak. I mean, there is this sort of terrible moment, which you almost touched on, Merve, I think it's in the fourth book, where she says that her Italian is, you know, she speaks dialect in a kind of forced way now, and dialect is the language in which she and Leela communicate, and they really basically can't communicate anymore because she's lost her ability, her naturalness with dialect, and Leela has not gone on to really use Italian. So
that's fascinating. And I just, to touch on another aspect of language, you've recently translated Jhumpa Lahiri's Whereabouts.
No, she translated it herself.
Oh, she translated it herself. But I thought that for me was the way the language was used in that was so interesting, because Italian's not her first language, but she wrote it originally in Italian, and then obviously she translated it back to English. I think the role of language in some of these books is particularly in the interior life of people and how it relates. You know, the language is taking us to a place that is beyond verbal. And I think that's what Ferrante set me off on that path. And I find Rachel Cusk, an author, a British author, who is also doing that. She's taking you to a place with her language that is really quite extraordinary and excavated, as we said before, searching for truth. I don't know if you think it falls into that tradition, Merve.
Well, I think it's a slightly different tradition, but I'll say I just saw a question in the Q&A from Ellen Moody, who says, I would like to know more about her that is helpful in understanding the novels. And I won't offer anything about the life because I can't, but you know, when I wrote about the quartet and when I wrote about the HBO adaptation, I had the opportunity to ask her some questions which were mediated by Anne. And that's another sort of fascinating experience in the mediation of language, right? When you write questions in English that someone else translates and then sends to an author who answers them in Italian, and then the answers get translated back into English and sent to you, right? So there's a sort of 3-woman chain there. And at some point, the question of who anyone is just drops out altogether, because the language is passing through the words are passing through so many languages and so many hands and so many choices of vocabulary, right? Like what words you're going to use to translate, that the question of person drops out. But to your point about Cust, I mean, one of the questions I asked her was, who are some contemporary novelists working today whom you admire? And she cited the Outline trilogy. And when I think about what that trilogy is doing that might be attractive to her, I think about the erasure of the narrator as an embodied presence in that trilogy, that we really have very little idea what that narrator looks like. Oftentimes we don't know precisely where she is in space. There are very sort of obscure markers given of where she is and in what time. And the way that speaking to other people, or that your relationships or your dialogue with other people then create a kind of outline of you, of who you are. There's something in that I think resonates very much with Leela and Lenu, and with Lenu's project to try to recover Leela from her act of erasing herself.
There's a great one here from Jennifer Edwards. I'm personally fascinated by the writing of the politics in these novels, in terms of the national large-scale politics of post-war Italy, and in how Leela and Lenu relate to feminism in their own lives. I suppose my question for Merve and Anne is around their reflections on the development of these politics, particularly around how they're explicitly or implicitly written. That's a big question. Merve, do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead, Merve.
Thanks, Anne, I will. No, that's a great question, and it's one that's preoccupied me, and like you said, Jennifer, particularly the feminist politics of it. I would say that I think the political register in these novels is implicit before it's explicit. So I think we see it implicitly in the unequal access that Leela and Lenu have to higher education, for instance, right? Because that's really, or to I think even secondary school education. Yeah. Because that's what sets them off on these two very different trajectories, or at least that's one point where their lives branch out in these really different ways. And so what we have there is a kind of articulation of the politics of education and what happens when we live in countries where education, for whatever reason, is either because of the norms of the culture or because of actual inability to access institutions of education. What happens when we live in countries where education isn't equally available to all people, right? That's a political argument, I think, that the novels are making. And then I think that the politics turn much more explicit by the time we get to the third novel. And when you have, and especially the feminist politics, right? When Lenu is actually going to those consciousness raising groups and they're reading the pamphlets, right? We Spit on Hegel. And there is the kind of articulation there through those real historical materials of that second wave, that moment in the rise of second wave feminism. And then I would say that the politics then become implicit again, because by the time you get to the fourth novel, one of the things you get, I think, is a really extraordinary imagination of what communal caregiving looks like. So when Lenu leaves and goes back to the neighborhood and moves in above Lila, and Lila takes care of her kids when she's in the middle of that, horrible depression, that idea of what it would mean to be able to allow yourself to be cared for by other people and your children to be cared for by other people, what it would mean to no longer be attached to the family as the unit in which care is distributed. I think that's one of the most powerful political arguments of that final novel, but also how tenuous those arrangements are, that they're not utopian, that they result in a lot of ugly feelings. They activate envy and resentment at the same time that they activate gratitude. And that to me is what's great. Part of what's great about the novels is that they have no rosy-eyed view of what solidarity between women looks like. They know that it continues to be a struggle emotionally, and even at some moments physically in these novels.
But I think it's what I always found interesting about the politics is that they're sort of they're really not explicit in any way, and it's sort of like the way you would experience them if you were living your life in that period. You would go to a march or a demonstration, but you wouldn't know the whole picture, kind of.
No, they're not didactic, and in fact, I think the novels, they kind of make fun of the moments when politics are didactic. So, those consciousness raising groups, they're quite ridiculous in hindsight, right?
Yeah, but I mean, but it gives you the sense. I mean, I actually happen to be about the same age as the narrator, so I felt like I was going through all those things that I didn't really, that impinged on my life, or that I was maybe part of a little bit, or knew about, or so it made me feel that I was, really that's what it was like to live in that time in a certain way.
I think it's interesting because if you're a child of, I will out myself. If you're a child of the 90s, then you haven't had, like, you do feel like, I think you're discovering some of that anew because it wasn't part of your coming of age story, right?
Right.
So there is something really, I think, interesting in maybe the generational reception of these novels, which is to say that women who didn't live through the 70s and the 80s see the politics as being coded as political rather than just part of the fabric of everyday life, the way that you put it, Anne.
Thank you. And we've got lots of questions coming in now. This is a statement, not a question, but it goes to something really important I'd like to talk about. The author's erasure allows the reader to become the narrator and blur boundaries in the same way that Lila and Lenu blur. And it's not just in the Neapolitan Quartet. I mean, the idea of boundaries and blurring and the one sense of self being erased it goes right through the novels. But is she trying to say different things, or is it a statement about the way that women are often erased in the society she's writing about? And how does it strike you, the matters of erasure in all these novels?
Well, I never think about anything as an overall, as you probably have noticed, a concept, but certainly the words, well, I mean, the now sort of famous word is smarginatura, the word that means losing your outlines, which is the experience that Leela has throughout the books, and which also comes to me to have a symbolic meaning as well. I mean, it's not just that she loses her sense of where she is or her sense of people or things. Yeah, but what this person is saying, there is a kind of blurring of, well, there's the blurring of the two girls in a way, the you know, Lanu and Leela, who is the brilliant friend. Although Merve, you seem to know who you think the brilliant friend is.
No. I you know, sometimes when you do one of these events and
yeah.
you are like, then you say something and then you're like kicking yourself 10 minutes later for having said the kind of wrong thing. And I was like, well, of course they're both the brilliant friends. And that's exactly what I was sort of beating myself up in my head for. No, you're totally.
I'm not holding you to anything.
No, you're totally right. You're totally right. It's funny. I was thinking about how, I mean, on some level, I'm just starting to believe that all good novels are novels about the loss of self and about the erasure of self, and then the attempt to kind of reconstitute the self. And I'm actually lecturing about this tomorrow in the context of Mrs. Dalloway. So I've been thinking about this a lot recently. But I think that one of the things that motivates or that prompts that kind of erasure is suffering. I mean, these are characters who suffer a great deal, and they suffer from their political and their economic circumstances. They suffer in the ways that I think all of us suffer, which is due to relationships in which people disappoint them, or in which they misjudge the people to whom they entrust themselves. And they suffer from their own guilt. And I think that suffering is often the way that your outlines start to feel indistinct to you, and that you don't quite feel like a complete or a whole or a solid self walking through the world. And there's a really interesting moment, and you can correct me if I get the details of this wrong, but it's in the second book when Leela and Lenu are on the beach and they're reading Beckett.
Oh.
Do you remember that? Do you remember which Beckett they're reading? I can't remember. Yeah, are they reading Happy Days or?
No. Oh, well, as soon as you said that, I can't remember now. But.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you'll remember it eventually. But they're reading Beckett, and they have this discussion about, you know, what does it mean to understand your own, or how do you make meaning out of your own life when you set it against the absolutely immense amount of suffering that there is in the world, and the fact that everybody suffers alone and in their own unique way. What does it even mean to live in that kind of world? And so I think that that's one way to think about what the, you know, why people's boundaries keep dissolving and then get you know, reconstituted through other people.
I think in Lying Life of Adults, you know, we've got a young woman at the start of her life who's sort of trying to test or is becoming rather than deconstructing. And I love the way she tests herself against her current life and against the life in the neighborhood, you know, her Aunt Victoria's life, which her parents have very much left behind. I thought that was one. And in fact, the next question is, please speak about the influence of past events on Naples, on the present reactions of the characters. Well, Naples is a character essentially in many respects. Have you visited Naples often? How is it a character in your life too?
No, well, not really, but I mean, I visited it enough to have a sense of it. It's an amazing place, but I think that I sort of said this a little bit in the Lying Life of Adults. Well, it sort of does opposite things. I mean, the Lying Life of Adults is a reversal in terms of the class situation. The narrator is it from a middle class family or a family that has become middle class, and she wants to go back to the working class roots of her father. She wants to find out what that's all about. But the interesting thing is that she's going from literally from being on the hill in Naples, which is the, the sort of bourgeois neighborhood, the wealthier neighborhood, and then she's going down to the working class neighborhood. Whereas in the Neapolitan novels, it's the opposite. They're in this outlying down neighborhood, and they are going to go. I mean, well, Lanu eventually will live actually in a place that's not that far from where Giovanna lives, going to the up neighborhood. So it's kind of like Naples is a built-in symbol of these things. It's literal, it's physical, and it's also obviously, whatever the other word is, intellectual, metaphorical. And the other thing about Naples is that in the fourth novel of the quartet, there's this whole historical section where Lila has become fascinated with the history of Naples, and she takes the daughter around, Lanu's youngest daughter, Ima, and tells her all these things about Naples. And that's kind of an amazing passage that doesn't get that much attention, but it's really gives you a sense of Naples and its history and its violence. I mean, it has pretty violent history.
I guess that's it, isn't it? The violence is embedded in a quite extraordinary way in all of this. Yes, wasn't Lila about to write? She wanted to write a book about the history of Naples.
Well, that's what Lanu thinks anyway.
Indeed, yes. And we've got a question from Gabriella. Isn't the loss of our self or outline connected to lying? It seems to me that Ferrante brilliantly conveys the impossibility of being fully truthful to ourselves. Not that we consciously, but that unconsciously we deny aspects of ourselves as the truth is unbearable to us, and denial protects us at times from breakdown, which is a little bit of what we've touched on earlier. Merve, do you want to just talk about how we get to that point of breakdown in Ferrante's novels?
Well, I mean, how do we get to that point of breakdown? I suppose, so maybe just to switch gears a little bit and talk about the lying life of adults and the point of breakdown there. I mean, I hope I won't ruin it for anybody when I say that the breakdown, I think, in that novel is occasioned by the fact that Giovanna recognizes that she is lying, right? And is in fact experimenting with lying, and falls in love or becomes infatuated with someone whom she takes to be the kind of anti-liar, whom she takes initially to be a kind of shining beacon of honesty. And one of the things I love in that novel, and I don't know if we've spoken about this before, but I love the compunction speech.
Oh, I know.
Compunction speech to me is just extraordinary, because this man that Giovanna falls for gives a kind of a sermon of sorts where he talks about how in our lives we are pricked by these moments of compunction, right? Where we are forced to account for ourselves. And I think the moment of breakdown in that novel at least happens when you realize that there is nobody in the universe of that novel who is actually honest. And to have invested a man with that kind of honesty and then fallen in love with him for it, and then to be incredibly disappointed, that is the moment of ultimate disillusionment, I think, in the novel. And so to me, the way that breakdown happens is sometimes we discover that we've been lying to ourselves, or we get caught lying to others. But sometimes we also misidentify or project qualities onto other people and refuse to see the truths about them. And that's another kind of lie that I think we tell all the time.
Well, look at Nino.
Yeah, look at Nino. Yeah, of course, Nino is. I mean, what's extraordinary to me that Nino has become, among readers of this novel, a kind of shorthand, right, for like the bad man, right? Like, so if a friend calls me now and has a complaint about a man, I mean, the line is almost always, he's such a Nino, Nino. And I think that's really, really funny because he is a totally recognizable type.
Yeah.
in the
and
world.
she doesn't recognize it for a long time.
No, she doesn't want to see. She doesn't want to see. Yeah. Yeah.
We've only got a few minutes left. I'd really like to finish off by just talking a little bit about where these stories come from. It's kind of the word fantumalia, I think, correct me, is it fragments, Anne?
Yeah, shattering fragments.
Shattering fragments. And there's this sort of, and she also makes the magma analogy, you know, it's almost like, so it's coming up from within and all these disparate fragments come, that's how a story comes together. And when you read the Neapolitan Quartet, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like one book that is extremely coherent. I don't know what her process was when she wrote it. It doesn't feel like fragments coming together. How does her writing process seem to you two, or what can we glean from it?
I have no idea. I mean, I don't know how I really don't have a sense of how of her process. I mean, I know that she had some ideas about some things that she wanted to include in the Neapolitan books, but I don't know how she put it together. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, because one thing that people don't mention a lot is that chronologically it's very complex. I mean, it goes back and forth in time a lot. So there's that aspect. There's the blurry outlines aspect. So it's very complex. And as Merve was saying earlier too, in your introduction, how complicated it is to.
Yeah, you can read it in so many ways. Merve, I think we've just got a few minutes left.
Yeah, I was just, reading all of her novels and also reading the novellas makes me think about how Henry James, when he wrote the prefaces to his New York editions, would often tell the story of how a novel came about by identifying a kind of germ. He would call it a seed or a germ of a novel. And it would usually be something very small, like a story he'd overheard at a dinner party of like, a little girl whose parents were getting divorced, right? And that's the germ for all of what Maisie knew. And I keep thinking about Ferrante and if there are germs to the entire project that we could identify, little seeds that you see coming up over and over again. So mothers and daughters, right? The relationship between a mother and a daughter is the most obvious one, is the most obvious one to me. The investment of false hope or false ideals in a man, another obvious one to me. The friendship, obviously, in the lying life of adults, we have a series of friendships that orbit the familial relationships in that novel. And when I put it that way to myself, I just think like we all have these things, right? This what I'm describing describes, experiences that almost everyone in this world has gone through in some way or another. And so I think when you think about her entire project as worrying these particular ideas over and over and over again and trying to get at them in every novella or novel from a different angle, from a different narrative point of view, in a different voice, then maybe the project, you can see it as fragments, right? That these are all part of this much, much, much larger consideration of these huge ideas.
Creepy dolls as well.
Yes.
Yeah, well, and clothes.
Yeah, and clothes, they recur over and again. We just got time for this one question. In fact, this is something we haven't touched on yet. Could you reflect, or Eleanor Sobrino says, could you reflect or speculate on whether you discern a psychoanalytical method at work in the novels? I think a lot of people wonder about that. Thank you so much. Love this discussion. Well, we've only got 4 minutes left, I'm afraid, but do you, I'm not sure I would say psychoanalytical. How does it strike you two?
I mean, I wouldn't say method, but I would say, going back to the term fantasmaglia, one of the interesting things, Anne, I don't know if you remember this from the interview / correspondence, but one of the ways there that she describes fantasmaglia is as the kind of chaos that lies within every person, that lies under their veneer of expression and of civilization, basically. That there is a kind of dark, unformed, unconscious matter that that runs through all of us. And of course, we also see that in book 4 of the quartet, when during the earthquake, right, when Lila sees everything's boundaries dissolving.
Yeah.
So that seems resonant with some ideas, some psychoanalytic ideas to me, at least.
I don't think it's I don't think Ferrante herself would say that she has psychoanalytic.
No.
No, I'm not saying. Yeah, I mean, I just think that's. I mean, I guess you could always see some psychoanalysis in everything.
I think we've analysed the novels brilliantly in this last hour. I'm going to hand back to Joan to finish, and I've just enjoyed myself immensely. So Joan, over to you.
Thank you so much. So 2 very instrumental things. If you have friends who are Ferrante fans, or you think they should be Ferrante fans, you can watch again on the York Ideas YouTube channel. And don't forget, all of the books are on sale with our wonderful independent bookseller, Foxlade Books. But Merve, Anne, Isabel, that was just wonderful. It was like being at the best book club, exploring these incredible themes that feel so visceral. To quote Merve, there is no rosy-eyed view in these books, and we certainly got a flavour of that. And the exploration of so many themes that resonate with all of us really stood out to me. And I loved the standout idea of the notion of fiction as the proxy to make us feel better about the lies that we tell ourselves to make sense of our own lives. And the resonance of these characters in terms of how we think about women's friendships, women and their mothers, women and their bodies, something that's very often now seemingly challenged again. So we seem to be reconsidering the notion of women having control of their bodies. So the journey you took us on the spectrum and the span of the novels, the impact of the novels, the role of the narrator, the social and political context of these novels, and the symbolic meaning of self has been just so illuminating and so well thought out. And to take us on that journey with such a level of acuity, empathy, and compunction has been really, truly wonderful. If, as Merve says, all good novels are about the idea of self and the erasure of self, then all good book events exploring novels should have you 3 participate. Thank you so much for spending the evening with us. It was utterly mesmeric and fascinating, as it always is with you. And so thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for such fantastic questions. Thank you and have a good evening from the York Festival of Ideas.